Hi folks, today what we're going to do is we're going to think about annotating the poem Basking Shark by Norman McCaig. Now you've done a little bit of work on the poem yourselves, so you should have a fair idea of what the story of the poem is, what it's about, and you should also have done a bit of thinking about the various techniques that McCaig has used to get his message across to us. So hopefully what we cover today isn't going to be too much of a surprise. So let's get started. Now, just before we get started, let's have a little bit of a think about what the themes of the poem are. Now, you'll remember a theme is something that people seem to find very confusing, but actually it's quite straightforward. The theme is the thing that the poet is trying to make you think about, okay? And in this poem, I think the things that, the biggest themes, the main themes are evolution. He's trying to make us think about that. And he's also trying to get us to think about our relationship with nature, our attitude to nature, to the other creatures in the world, and our place in nature. So those are the things that we should be thinking about as we move through the poem today. Now, lots of McCaig poems, what McCaig does is he takes an experience he's had and he shares with us the things that that experience has made him think about. So if we think about his poem, I tend to think about them as it's almost a journey to this sort of answer to a big question that he will come up with throughout his poem. Now, in this poem, we're obviously dealing with an experience he has one day when he's out fishing, and this a monstrous, enormous shark appears out of the water beside him. Now, obviously, he was shocked to begin with, but when he calmed down, when he sat back a little bit, what it made him think about was how all the different creatures in the world have evolved differently. Okay, and the fact that basking sharks, well, they've remained pretty much unchanged for a very, very long time. Human beings are a completely different thing from what we were at the beginning of life, if you like. Now, what that leads him to think about is who we are in relation to all the rest of the creatures on the planet. Who's the monster is the question he ends up with. So is it the shark, which to begin with he thinks is a monster, or is it actually us because of the things that, you know, as a human race we do to the world and we do to our fellow creatures? And that's what he's really asking us to examine with him as we travel through the poem. Just before we begin our annotations, it's a good idea to make sure that we have a firm grasp on what's happening in the poem. And I think in the last slide I talked about the fact that we can see the poem as a kind of journey as McCaig thinks his way through this issue that's popped up in his head. And if we trace through the stanzas, we can see the shape that that journey takes. So if we think about stanza 1, what we've got there is a description of his experience of his meeting with the shark, and also we gather something of his initial reaction to it, his shock. Okay, stanza 2, he sits back a little bit and he thinks about the effect that that meeting has had on him and what it's provoking him to think about. He also gives us a little bit more description of the experience, which helps us to understand or to be there with him, which really helps us understand his chain of thought and what he's thinking. Stanza 3, he begins to think about his own position in the evolutionary process. He's a little bit negative about himself. He refers to himself as a decadent townie. He recognises that maybe he's become a little bit distant from nature. Stanza 4, he begins to look at how at the beginning we all came from the same place and that we are all interrelated, all the different species on Earth. Okay. Now stanza 5 is where his reflections end up. So stanza 1 and 2, his experience, description of that, description of his reactions to it. Stanza 3 and 4 is his reflection about his place in the world and about evolution. And stanza 5 is kind of his conclusion. Okay, this is the conclusion that he comes to, having reflected on all those themes or issues. So in stanza 5, we see a marked difference in, firstly, his perspective on the shark, which is no longer a monster but has become something much more beautiful, and secondly, his opinion of us, of humanity, and in our relation to the rest of the world and the rest of the creatures on the world. And that rhetorical question in stanza 5, really focuses that for us. Now here we've got a list of the kind of techniques that McCaig uses in his poem to get us to think about the message. Now we are not going to really take his message on board unless we can visualise his experience, unless we can follow his chain of thought. And in order to get us to do that, he uses lots of poetic techniques, poetic tools out of his toolbox. I think we've talked about that analogy. In order to get us to think our way through it and to understand where he's coming from. Now, you've done a bit of work on the poem previously, and these are some of the things that you might have focused on as you made your way through the stanzas. Now, if you want to pause here and go off, have another look at your poem, see if you can identify any of these things that you might have missed as you went through it. That might be a good idea, okay, but I'll leave that one up to you. Now, let's go on and have a look at the poem together.